The Mississippi River in the spring of 1863 was less a body of water and more a manifestation of a nation's will. It flowed, a broad, brown, implacable serpent, through the very soul of a divided America. Its course was a geopolitical scalpel, and the hand that controlled it held the lifeblood of the Confederacy. To the west lay the flat, waterlogged fields of Louisiana, a landscape of miasma and misery, of cypress stumps and malaria-haunted bayous. To the east rose the state of Mississippi, the fertile heartland of the nascent Confederacy, its plantations still producing the cotton and food that sustained the rebellion. And between them, commanding a hairpin turn of the river, sat the city of Vicksburg. It was not a city of grand buildings or wide avenues, but a fortress carved by nature and fortified by desperation. It clung to a series of 200-foot bluffs, a Gibraltar of the West, its guns staring down the throat of any who dared approach by water. This was the Confederate linchpin, the final, critical connection between the rebel states east of the river and the food supplies, horses and manpower of the vast Trans-Mississippi region, Texas, Arkansas and Louisiana. As long as Vicksburg stood, the Confederacy could breathe, a two-lunged entity. Its fall would be a geopolitical strangulation, a collapse of the Western Front that would isolate nearly a third of the Confederacy's territory. President Abraham Lincoln, gazing at maps in the White House, understood this with crystalline clarity. "Vicksburg is the key," he stated. "The war can never be brought to a close until that key is in our pocket." The man tasked with turning this key was a study in contradiction. Major General Ulysses S. Grant, once dismissed as a drunken failure and driven from the army in peacetime, now commanded the Union's Army of the Tennessee. He was not a flamboyant figure like McClellan or a political general like Butler. He wore a private's rumpled uniform, often stained with mud, chewed on unlit cigars, and possessed a quiet, almost unsettling calmness that masked a mind of granite resolve. His strategic vision, however, was breathtaking in its audacity. He understood that this was not a war won by capturing empty fields or even cities in set-piece battles, but by annihilating armies and severing logistical arteries. Vicksburg was the ultimate prize, and every other consideration, political pressure, newspaper criticism, his own reputation, was secondary. In his Spartan headquarters at Milliken's Bend, Louisiana, north of the city, Grant stared at maps that told a disheartening story. Direct naval assault from the river was suicide. Against the 128 heavy cannon that comprised the Vicksburg batteries, including massive 10-inch Columbiads and rifled Whitworths that could hurl a shell with devastating accuracy over 2 miles. A land approach from the north was stymied by the Yazoo River Delta, a 40-mile-wide morass of impassable swamps, tangled bayous, and sluggish streams, a natural moat that protected the city's northern flank. And waiting behind this formidable terrain was a vast Confederate army under the command of Lieutenant General John C. Pemberton, a man as complex as the problem he presented. Pemberton, a Pennsylvania-born Quaker who had sided with the South out of loyalty to his wife and adopted state of Virginia, was a skilled defensive engineer and a dedicated officer. He commanded 35,000 men, dug into a labyrinth of fortifications that stretched for miles, from Haynes's Bluff on the Yazoo to the south of Vicksburg itself. He was confident, believing he held an unassailable position. The winter and early spring of 1863 became a season of frustration and mud, a brutal chess match played not on a clean board, but in a quagmire. Grant, refusing to be stymied, became an engineer of the impossible. He ordered his army, a force of Midwestern farmers, shopkeepers, and immigrants, to attempt a series of Herculean and ultimately futile ventures. The first was the Canal across DeSoto Point, a massive excavation effort to divert the Mississippi River itself, cutting a channel that would allow Union boats to bypass Vicksburg entirely. Thousands of men, their bodies caked in mud, labored with shovels and picks under the relentless rain, only to see their work repeatedly swallowed by the rising, indifferent river. Next came the Lake Providence route, a labyrinthine passage through the bayous of western Louisiana that promised a backdoor approach. It proved a navigational nightmare, a tangle of narrow, shallow channels choked with vegetation, utterly unsuitable for moving an army and its supply train. Then, the most promising yet disastrous of all, the Yazoo Pass expedition. This involved blowing a levee on the Mississippi to flood a passage into the Yazoo River Delta above Vicksburg. A Union flotilla, including ironclads and transports, pushed into this drowned world. For weeks they fought not Confederates, but nature itself, snagging on submerged trees, navigating treacherous currents in channels so narrow the ship's guns brushed against overhanging cypress limbs. The expedition was finally ambushed and decisively repulsed at a hastily constructed Confederate fortification named Fort Pemberton, a mere breastwork of earth and cotton bales armed with a handful of cannon near the town of Greenwood. Each failure was a headline in northern newspapers like the New York World calling for Grant's removal. Grant's folly, they called it, the quagmire of Vicksburg. Each setback seemed to confirm the prevailing military wisdom. Vicksburg was invulnerable. In Richmond, Confederate President Jefferson Davis felt a growing assurance. In Vicksburg, the citizens and soldiers, watching the futile Union activity from their bluffs, felt a sense of invincibility. Pemberton, reinforcing his lines with the grim satisfaction of a man who held all the high ground, believed he was fighting a conventional war of fixed positions. By all conventional metrics, he was winning. But what Pemberton and his superiors in Richmond perceived as Grant's flailing desperation was, in fact, a relentless and brutal process of elimination. Grant was a learner, not a dogmaist. While his men dug canals and dragged gunboats through swamps, he was learning the land, its miseries, its hidden pathways, the rhythm of the river. He was conditioning his army to movement, to hardship, to the unthinkable. He was studying Pemberton, discerning his cautious, by-the-book mentality. And in that crucible of failure, a plan of staggering, almost reckless boldness began to form in his mind. It was a plan that defied every principle in Jomini's art of war. A gamble that would have ended the career of a less determined or politically connected commander. The core of the idea was simple, yet to any contemporary military mind, insane. He would march his entire army down the Louisiana side of the river, while Admiral David Dixon Porter's gunboats and transports would run the gauntlet of the Vicksburg batteries under cover of darkness. Once the naval force was south of the city, Grant would cross the mighty Mississippi, landing his army in the heart of Mississippi. Then, in the most audacious move of all, he would deliberately cut loose from his own supply lines. He would live off the land, placing his army between Pemberton and Vicksburg and any potential reinforcements under the flamboyant but cautious General Joseph E. Johnston, gathering in Jackson, the state capital. It was a move that courted utter destruction. If he failed, if he was checked or defeated in battle, his army would be trapped, deep in enemy territory, with no line of retreat and no source of supply, facing annihilation or surrender. He was betting everything, his career, his army, arguably the Union cause in the West, on his belief in his men's endurance and his opponent's paralysis. The execution of this plan began with what would become one of the most dramatic naval actions of the war. The night of April 16, 1863, was pitch black, the kind of darkness that feels like a physical presence, a cloak that could hide an army or a fleet. On the river north of Vicksburg, silence was the paramount order. Aboard 7 of Admiral Porter's gunboats, including the powerful ironclads USS Benton, Porter's flagship, Carondelet, Pittsburgh, and Lafayette, and a string of wooden transports and barges, crews waited with bated breath. Every precaution was taken. Steam was kept low to minimize the telltale hissing and clanking of engines. Boiler fires were banked, their flickering light hidden. Coal was piled high on decks, and the more vulnerable vessels were lashed to the sides of the ironclads. To absorb Confederate shot, engineers had lined the decks and paddle wheel housings with bales of cotton and hay, creating a strange agricultural armor. At 11 p.m., the order was given in hushed tones. The great dark shapes like phantom leviathans began to creep downstream, their paddle wheels churning the water with a soft rhythmic splash. For nearly an hour, the silence held, the tension aboard each vessel palpable. Then from the bluffs of Vicksburg, a flicker of light. A single rocket arced into the sky, bursting into a shower of red sparks against the velvet black. The illusion was shattered. In an instant, the night erupted into a man-made hell. The entire Vicksburg waterfront exploded in flame as every Confederate cannon, from the water batteries at the river's edge to the guns high on the bluffs, opened fire. The river itself seemed to boil under the storm of iron. Shells shrieked overhead, tearing through the darkness with trails of fire, some skipping like stones across the water before exploding. The Union ships, their own boilers now fired to maximum pressure, surged forward, their pilots steering a desperate slalom through the geysers of water thrown up by impacting shells. Porter's crews replied with their own broadsides, the orange flashes of their cannon momentarily illuminating their silhouettes. making them perfect targets for the Confederate gunners above. For 2 hours, this infernal parade continued, a spectacle of fire and sound that could be seen and heard for 50 miles, a terrifying pyrotechnic display witnessed by the terrified civilians of Vicksburg and the grimly determined Union soldiers waiting on the western shore. When the smoke cleared and the sun rose, revealing a river littered with debris, the tally was made. Most of Porter's fleet, though battered and scarred, had made it through. One transport was sunk, others were damaged, but the vital naval power was now south of Vicksburg. The impossible had been dared, and it had worked. The first, most dangerous move in Grant's grand gamble had paid off. The next phase was an operational masterpiece, a campaign of maneuver that would be studied for generations in war colleges around the world. Grant now had to move his army. In a feint designed to confuse Pemberton, he sent Colonel Benjamin Grierson on one of the most brilliant cavalry raids of the war. With 700 horsemen, Grierson thrust deep into Mississippi, tearing up railroads, burning depots, and fighting skirmishes across the state, drawing Confederate attention and thousands of troops away from Vicksburg and the intended crossing point. While Pemberton was frantically trying to catch this phantom in his rear, Grant's infantry, some 40,000 strong, began a grueling march down the western bank of the Mississippi. They slogged through Louisiana mire, corduroying roads with felled trees, building bridges over swollen streams, all the while screened from Confederate eyes on the opposite shore. Their destination was a point south of Vicksburg, near the hamlet of Hard Times. Porter's gunboats now provided the ferry service. On April 30th at Bruinsburg, Mississippi, a few miles downstream, the crossing began. As the first Union soldiers of the 24th Iowa scrambled up the eastern bluffs, unopposed, Grant, standing on the bank, felt a surge of profound confidence. He later wrote, "I felt a degree of relief scarcely ever equaled since I was now in the enemy's country, with a vast river and the stronghold of Vicksburg between me and my base of supplies. But I was on dry ground on the same side of the river with the enemy. He was behind Pemberton, between him and Johnston. The strategic trap was set. What followed was 17 days of breathtaking audacity and relentless motion. Grant moved with a speed and aggression that completely unhinged the Confederate command structure. Pemberton, a man schooled in defensive warfare and now hopelessly entangled in a web of conflicting orders, was paralyzed. President Davis in Richmond insisted Vicksburg must be held at all costs. General Johnston, the overall theater commander, telegraphing from central Mississippi, understood the danger and repeatedly ordered Pemberton to abandon Vicksburg if necessary, to unite their forces and crush Grant's isolated army in the open field. Pemberton, feeling loyalty to Davis and fearing the political fallout of abandoning the Gibraltar of the West, tried to obey both masters and succeeded in obeying neither. He expected Grant to move cautiously to protect his supply line back to Grand Gulf. Grant did the opposite. He cut himself loose entirely, ordering his men to carry only what they could on their backs: a few days' rations and 40 rounds of ammunition. The fertile countryside of Mississippi, ripe with early summer crops and full of livestock, became his commissary. This was a calculated risk. It forced speed and decisiveness upon his army, for they had to win quickly or starve. It also sent a clear message to his men: there was no going back. Their safety lay in forward movement, in victory. The first test of this new, lean army came immediately. A Confederate force of about 8,000 men under Brigadier General John S. Bowen had rushed south from Grand Gulf to block Grant's path at Port Gibson. The battle was fought on May 1st across a bizarre, beautiful, and difficult landscape of deep, wooded ravines and narrow ridges that locals called gullies. The fighting was fierce and often confused in the rough terrain, but the Union veterans, their morale high from the successful crossing, pressed the attack. Grant, overseeing the battle, saw his troops gradually push the outnumbered Confederates back. By the end of the day, Bowen's force was in retreat, and the road into the interior of Mississippi was unlocked. Grant had won his first victory on the eastern side of the river. The door was open. Now came the critical strategic decision. The obvious conventional move was to turn north and advance directly on Vicksburg, just over 40 miles away. But Grant, thinking like a grandmaster, looked several moves ahead. He knew that General Joseph E. Johnston was in Jackson, just 45 miles to the northeast, gathering a force that, if united with Pemberton's, could potentially crush him. To turn his back on Johnston was to invite a devastating attack on his rear. So Grant made his boldest decision yet. He would ignore Vicksburg for the moment. He would drive northeast toward Jackson. His objective was not to capture a city, but to annihilate an army, first Johnston's, then Pemberton's. He was executing the fundamental principle of war in its purest form. First, isolate your enemy, then destroy him. He moved his 3 corps, McPherson's, McClernand's, and Sherman's, with lightning speed. On May 12th, McPherson's corps encountered a Confederate brigade at the town of Raymond. Expecting a minor skirmish, the Union troops instead walked into a furious fight. The Confederates, though outnumbered, attacked with such ferocity that it took hard, bloody fighting for McPherson to finally drive them from the field. The Battle of Raymond was a sharp, costly shock that confirmed to Grant the presence of a significant Confederate force in his path. It forced General Johnston, who had just arrived in Jackson, to telegraph Pemberton the famous frantic message, "I am too late." Johnston, realizing the gravity of the situation, knew he could not hold Jackson with his patchwork force. On May 14th, Grant's army converged on Jackson, Mississippi's capital. A heavy rain fell, turning the roads to mud. Sherman's corps attacked from the northwest, McPherson's from the southwest. The Confederate defenses, manned by Johnston's small army, were thin. After several hours of fighting in the downpour, Union troops broke through the lines and poured into the city. Johnston, recognizing the hopelessness of his position, had already ordered a retreat northward, abandoning the city to Grant. The Union Army had captured the capital of the second state to secede, but Grant was not interested in occupation. He spent one day, May 15th, personally overseeing the destruction of the city's war-making potential. His men, with a systematic fury, wrecked railroad tracks, twisting the iron rails in bonfires, the origin of Sherman's neckties. They burned factories, foundries, and warehouses. They severed all telegraph lines. Jackson was neutralized as a military center. The anvil was set. Now Grant immediately turned his entire army to the west to face the hammer, Pemberton's army, which was finally, belatedly, on the move. Pemberton, confused and pressured, had indeed marched out of Vicksburg with about 23,000 men, aiming to strike what he believed was Grant's long, vulnerable supply line. He was operating under a misinterpretation of Johnston's orders and his own flawed intelligence. He believed Grant was retreating, not advancing. The two armies, Grant moving west from Jackson and Pemberton moving southeast from Vicksburg, were on a collision course. They met on the wooded, rolling hills around Champion Hill, the highest point in Mississippi, on May 16th. This was not a skirmish. It was a full-scale, brutal battle for the fate of the Confederacy in the West. The battle unfolded like a 3-act tragedy. The Union line stretched across the crest of the ridge, while Pemberton's army was arrayed on the slopes and in the woods below. For hours, the fighting surged back and forth across the slopes and the open field of the Matson farm. The air grew thick with the acrid smell of burnt powder and the deafening, ripping roar of massed musketry. At a critical moment in the afternoon, a Union division under General Alvin P. Hovey, fighting with desperate intensity, was being pressed hard on the Union left. The situation was precarious, but on the Confederate left, a gap had opened. Grant, with the cool eye of a master, saw the crack in Pemberton's armor. He ordered General John A. Blackjack Logan's division of McPherson's corps to attack. Logan, a charismatic and fierce fighter, led his men forward in a screaming, bayonet-wielding charge that shattered the Confederate flank. It was here that Grant's relentless pressure and superior numbers paid off. The Confederate line, attacked fiercely in front and now crumbling on the flank, began to disintegrate. A frantic, disorganized retreat began, turning into a rout as Union artillery raked the fleeing soldiers. The Battle of Champion Hill was the decisive engagement of the campaign. It broke the back of Pemberton's field army, inflicting over 3,800 casualties and capturing 30 vital cannon. The road to Vicksburg was now wide open, and the Confederate army was a broken, demoralized stream flowing back toward its fortress. The following day, a rearguard action at the Big Black River Bridge was swiftly and decisively crushed by Sherman's advancing corps. Confederate engineers had built a formidable line of rifle pits behind a waist-deep, sluggish bayou, with the one bridge as a choke point. But when a Union assault overwhelmed a section of the line, panic spread. Confederate soldiers, still reeling from Champion Hill, fled in such disorder that they did not even burn the bridge behind them, allowing Sherman's men to cross in pursuit. The shattered remnants of Pemberton's army now streamed back into the defenses of Vicksburg, their confidence shattered. The Union army followed, its morale sky high, believing the city was now within its grasp, a ripe fruit ready to fall. The men, though weary from weeks of marching and fighting, sensed an end was near. This belief led to the first great tragedy of the Vicksburg siege. On May 19th, Grant, hoping to capitalize on the panic and disorganization of the enemy, ordered a mass assault against the stockade redan, a powerful fortification guarding the northern approach to the city. He believed the Confederates were too demoralized to put up a stiff fight. He was wrong. The Vicksburg fortifications were a masterpiece of military engineering, a complex network of trenches, lunettes, redans, and redoubts, interconnected and mutually supporting, stretched for miles. The approaches were steep, raked by interlocking fields of fire, and obstructed by abatis, felled trees with sharpened branches pointing outward. His troops, the veterans of the Army of the Tennessee, advanced with courage but were met by a storm of musket and cannon fire from the entrenched Confederates. They were thrown back with heavy losses, unable to even reach the main Confederate works. Undeterred, and still believing the enemy was on the verge of collapse, Grant ordered a second, larger and more carefully planned assault on May 22nd. This time, the entire army went forward in a coordinated attack at 10:10 a.m., preceded by a massive artillery bombardment from land and river. For a moment, it seemed it might work. In several sectors, Union troops, including the famed U.S. colored troops of the Corps d'Afrique, who fought with ferocious courage to prove their mettle, reached the ditches fronting the Confederate parapets. Some even planted their flags on the slopes of the works, like the 45th Illinois at the Great Redoubt, but they could not break through. The fighting was hand-to-hand and brutal across a 3-mile front. Soldiers clubbed each other with muskets, stabbed with bayonets, and threw rocks and crude grenades. At the 2nd Texas Lunette, a ferocious Confederate counterattack pushed the Union soldiers back with appalling losses. By early afternoon, it was clear the attack had failed catastrophically, costing Grant nearly 3,200 casualties against a Confederate loss of fewer than 500. The Confederates, emboldened by their successful defense, taunted the Union soldiers from their works, holding up signs that read, "Yanks, come and get us." The message was clear and grim. Vicksburg would not be taken by storm. The failure of the assaults forced a profound and grim change in strategy. The brilliant campaign of maneuver was over. What began now was a siege, a slow, methodical, and merciless process of encirclement and starvation. Grant's army, now reinforced to over 70,000 men, began the tedious, dangerous work of sapping. A complex web of approach trenches, saps, and parallels began to creep inexorably toward the Confederate lines, day and night, under the blistering Mississippi sun and the constant, unnerving threat of sniper fire from Confederate sharpshooters like the legendary Whistling Dick, a specific, large cannon, an expert marksman, Union soldiers, many of whom had been Midwestern farmers, used their picks and shovels as skillfully as they had once used their rifles. They dug zigzag trenches to avoid enfilading fire, built fortified batteries for their own artillery, and slowly, inevitably, moved their lines forward. They used saps, deep, narrow trenches dug directly toward the enemy, protected by large, movable wicker gabions filled with earth. Mining operations began, with teams of soldiers and former coal miners from Illinois and Ohio digging tunnels deep under Confederate strongpoints like the 3rd Louisiana Redan, packing them with thousands of pounds of black powder. The subsequent explosions on June 25th and July 1st were titanic, blasting huge craters in the landscape. But each time the follow-up Union infantry assaults were bloodily repulsed in the chaotic crater fights that ensued. Inside Vicksburg, the reality of the siege set in with a terrible, grinding inevitability. The 30,000 Confederate soldiers and 3,000 civilians were trapped to escape the relentless, around-the-clock bombardment from hundreds of Union artillery pieces and Porter's gunboats on the river, a hail of iron that demolished buildings and shattered nerves. The population was forced to live in caves dug into the yellow clay hillsides. These cave dwellers created a subterranean city, their lives regulated by the scream of incoming shells. It was living in a grave, one woman wrote. Food became desperately scarce. The official ration was reduced to a handful of peas and a bit of rice, then to mule and horse meat. Rats became a sought-after delicacy. A small withered pea sold for $1. Disease, dysentery, malaria, scurvy, ran rampant through the malnourished defenders and civilians. Hospitals overflowed with the sick and wounded, and amputations were performed without anesthesia. The hill city became a city of the living dead, its defenders growing visibly weaker and more emaciated by the day, their hope dwindling with each passing hour under the relentless Union shelling, known as the Whistling Death. Morale, once high after the repulsed assaults, collapsed into a grim, hollow-eyed despair. The soldiers, in their ragged uniforms, could barely stand to their posts. They knew that Joseph E. Johnston, hovering to the east with a small army of relief, would not and could not break the siege. They were utterly alone. For 47 days, the siege ground on, a battle of endurance between the patient, well-fed besiegers and the starving, desperate besieged. By the end of June, Pemberton was receiving reports that his men were too weak to mount an effective counterattack, that whole regiments were on the verge of mutiny. He polled his division commanders. Should they attempt to cut their way out? The answer was a unanimous and devastating no. It was hopeless. On the morning of July 3rd, 1863, the same day the Battle of Gettysburg was reaching its bloody climax in Pennsylvania, white flags began to appear along the Confederate works. Pemberton, a man broken by circumstance, the weight of command and the suffering of his men, rode out to meet Grant under a flag of truce near the Shirley House, a structure that would become known as the White House of the siege. The meeting was tense, formal. The two generals, who had last faced each other in the Mexican War as young lieutenants, sat on a log under a stunted oak tree. Grant, remembering the humiliation of Fort Donelson and his unconditional surrender demand to Buckner, offered those same terms. Pemberton, hoping to spare his men the indignity and almost certain death of northern prison camps, bargained for their parole. After a day of tense negotiation, Grant, showing a keen political and logistical mind, relented. He knew that paroling the 29,000 Confederate soldiers, simply having them sign a paper promising not to fight again until formally exchanged, would avoid the monumental logistical nightmare of transporting, feeding, and guarding them in northern prisons. It would also effectively remove this entire army from the war board for the foreseeable future. The terms were agreed upon. The formal surrender came on July 4th, 1863, Independence Day. It was no coincidence in Grant's mind. It was a powerful symbolic stroke. As the ragged, starving Confederate soldiers marched out of Vicksburg, stacking their arms and furling their battle flags in silence, the Union Army stood at attention. There was no cheering, no taunting from the victorious blue columns. A respectful, almost funereal silence prevailed, a recognition of the shared suffering, the immense courage on both sides, and the magnitude of the moment. The Union soldiers, who had for so long looked at these bluffs with a mixture of dread and determination, now looked upon their former enemies with a soldier's pity and respect. The capture of Vicksburg, coupled with the Union victory at Gettysburg the day before, marked the undeniable, irreversible turning point of the American Civil War. The Confederacy was physically split in two. The Mississippi River, in President Abraham Lincoln's famous phrase, flowed unvexed to the sea. The Anaconda Plan, the grand Union strategy of blockade and division conceived at the war's outset, was now complete. Grant's Vicksburg campaign became the textbook example of operational art, a symphony of deception, speed, audacious risk-taking, and relentless pursuit that neutralized every Confederate advantage of terrain and position. It made Ulysses S. Grant the undisputed hero of the Union war effort, earning him the command of all Union armies and setting him on the path that would end at Appomattox Courthouse. For the Confederacy, it was a wound from which it would never truly recover. The Gibraltar of the West had fallen, and with it, the hope of a nation. The long, bloody road to reunion now, for the first time, had a visible end, illuminated by the flash of cannon over the Mississippi and the silent, solemn stacking of muskets on the 4th of July.